The Academy Awards are coming up, and I think you have.
At 76, the woman Hollywood once worshipped for her calm and perfection finally admitted something no one expected. Meryl Streep, the symbol of intelligence, discipline, and quiet kindness, revealed that there were 6 people she could never forgive. 6 names, 6 wounds, 6 moments that exposed the cruelty hiding behind the art she dedicated her life to. No one ever thought Meryl capable of hate. Yet behind half a century of silence lived glances, words, and betrayals that cut deeper than any role she ever played. She did not speak to take revenge. She spoke to admit that pride and pain can coexist inside the same heart. And when those 6 names were finally spoken, people realized that Meryl's serenity was never a gift. It was a price. To remain composed for a lifetime, she had to swallow the kind of rage only an artist could endure. As these 6 faces are revealed, you'll understand that Meryl Streep's perfection was built not only on talent, but on the enemies who defined it. John Wayne, the clash between 2 Americas. It happened long before Meryl Streep became the legend she is now. She was still the rising force of a new generation, thoughtful, liberal, and fiercely intelligent when she first crossed paths with John Wayne, the man who embodied the old America. He was the ultimate symbol of masculinity, patriotism, and conservative values. She, on the other hand, represented the changing winds, feminism, complexity, and moral nuance. Their worlds collided in the late 1970 seconds. When the film industry was shifting, Wayne, already in his twilight years, was public about his disdain for method actors and the new, self-conscious art of cinema. Meryl, who had just stunned audiences with her raw performance in The Deer Hunter, was exactly what he resented: thoughtful, emotional, and unwilling to glorify simple heroism. They never worked together, but their confrontation happened on public ground. In an interview, when asked about the new generation of actors, Wayne scoffed and said, "They're too busy feeling to remember they're supposed to entertain." It was a veiled attack, but everyone knew who he meant. Meryl had become the face of that new generation, emotional, introspective, and dangerously honest. When asked about his remark months later, she replied with a calm smile that only deepened the divide. "I think people who don't question themselves usually end up acting instead of understanding." The quote spread quickly through the press. To the old guard, it sounded like arrogance. To the young, it was a declaration of independence. For Meryl, it was neither. It was self-defense. She had spent her early years fighting for the right to exist in a world that didn't want women to be too clever, too intense, or too articulate. Wayne, by then weakened by illness, took her words personally. In his final public appearance before his death in 1979, he referred to those young actresses who think they're philosophers, calling them a symptom of a weak America. It was his last shot at the culture that was leaving him behind, and Meryl became its unwilling symbol. For years after his death, she avoided mentioning him. When journalists brought up his comments, she deflected with elegance. But in private circles, those who knew her said that Wayne represented something deeper than one man's opinion. He was the wall she had to break through. In her confession decades later, she didn't speak of hatred as anger. She spoke of it as exhaustion. John Wayne stood for a world that had no place for women like me. And maybe that's why I couldn't forgive him. Not for what he said, but for what he meant. It wasn't a personal feud. It was ideological, a battle between 2 versions of America. The old one, proud and unbending. The new one, fragile but searching for truth. In the end, Meryl's career would redefine what an American actor could be: intellectual, emotional, politically aware. Wayne's shadow remained, though the echo of an era that refused to die quietly. Some rivalries are not between two people, but between two centuries. Meryl didn't hate John Wayne for who he was. She hated the silence he demanded and the courage it took to break it. Dustin Hoffman, the control obsession. It was 1979. And Kramer versus. Kramer was supposed to be Meryl Streep's breakthrough, a film about love, divorce, and motherhood that would define her as one of Hollywood's most gifted actresses. But behind the camera, another story was unfolding, one that Meryl would later describe as both formative and traumatic. Dustin Hoffman, already a star, was known for his intensity and obsession with realism. He believed in breaking his co-stars emotionally to capture truth. Meryl, meticulous and emotionally intelligent, believed in trust. Their philosophies clashed from the first day of shooting. According to the crew, Hoffman pushed boundaries far beyond professionalism. He insulted her before takes, interrupted her lines, and even slapped her without warning in one scene, all in the name of method acting. To him, she was a tool for his performance. To her, he was crossing into cruelty. Years later, Meryl recalled the experience not with outrage, but with a chilling calm. He was brilliant, but he wanted to control everything, even the truth. And truth doesn't belong to anyone. At the time, she was still grieving the death of her boyfriend, John Cazale. Hoffman knew it, and some say he used that vulnerability to provoke real emotion on set. The result was extraordinary. Her performance earned her first Oscar. The price was invisible but permanent. In interviews afterward, Hoffman dismissed the tension. "We were like brother and sister," he said, laughing. But those who witnessed it described something darker. Meryl would arrive to set quiet, distant. Between takes, she would walk alone, rehearsing not her lines, but her composure. Hollywood praised the chemistry, never realizing it was born from discomfort. The industry called it art. Meryl called it survival. She never confronted Hoffman publicly. She didn't need to. Her silence became her statement. Decades later, when journalists revisited those stories, she chose her words carefully. I think that sometimes people mistake abuse for dedication. And that's dangerous, because when cruelty is rewarded, it becomes part of the culture. Her reflection wasn't about one man. It was about a system, the idea that suffering makes art more real, that women must endure pain to prove their worth. Hoffman, in her eyes, symbolized that sickness. When asked whether she ever forgave him, she hesitated before answering, "No, but I learned from him what kind of actor I never wanted to become." The irony was cruel. Kramer versus Kramer made both of them icons. Their shared Oscar night smiles were masks. Behind them stood two very different victories, his for domination, hers for endurance. Years later, during a reunion event, they stood side by side on stage. Hoffman reached to put an arm around her. Meryl smiled politely, then turned slightly away. The audience saw a nostalgic moment. Those who knew her saw the quiet rebellion of a woman who refused to let history repeat itself. Some lessons are not taught, they're survived. For Meryl Streep, Dustin Hoffman was not a rival to defeat, but a mirror reflecting Hollywood's oldest flaw, the belief that power equals brilliance. And she would spend her career proving the opposite. Jack Nicholson, the broken mirror. They were supposed to admire each other. Two of Hollywood's most celebrated actors, Meryl Streep and Jack Nicholson, both known for intelligence, intensity, and an almost dangerous charisma. When they worked together on Heartburn in 1986, the pairing felt inevitable, the perfect balance of wit and fire. But what began as mutual respect soon collapsed into quiet resentment, leaving Meryl with one of her deepest professional scars. Nicholson was a force of nature, spontaneous, unpredictable, always in command. Meryl came prepared, layered, deliberate. On set, their approaches clashed like fire and ice. Jack thrived on chaos. Meryl sought control. During early rehearsals, he teased her precision, saying, "You act like a schoolteacher grading emotions." It was meant as a joke, but it cut deep. She smiled through it, but something in her changed. As filming progressed, he began improvising lines, deliberately throwing her off balance. In one key scene, he added vulgar jokes that weren't in the script, making her reaction real and uncomfortable. The director laughed. Jack called it authentic. Meryl called it disrespect. Behind the camera, crew members noticed the tension. Nicholson, charming to everyone else, often ignored her input or interrupted her mid-scene. "She's too careful," he told a journalist during promotion. "She thinks acting is surgery." Meryl said nothing publicly, but in private, she told a friend, "He confuses freedom with carelessness. He thinks rebellion makes him profound." Their professional rift became visible during interviews. When asked about working with Jack, she replied simply, "He's brilliant. He's also exhausting." The phrase spread across the industry, subtle, cold, and deliberate. Jack's response came days later. "She's the best technician I've ever worked with, a bit too good." Maybe. It was the kind of backhanded compliment only Hollywood could produce. To outsiders, it looked like playful banter. To insiders, it was open warfare, ego disguised as admiration. Years later, Meryl reflected on that project as a turning point. Heartburn was a story about betrayal, a wife discovering her husband's infidelity. But behind the scenes, the betrayal wasn't fictional. "I realized," she once said, "that some people confuse cruelty with honesty. They hurt you, then call it art." Their relationship never healed. They were invited to reunite for another film in the 1,990 seconds, but Meryl declined without hesitation. "I've done that dance," she told her agent. "Once is enough." Jack never apologized. He didn't have to. He belonged to a generation that saw confrontation as a game. For him, conflict was fuel. For Meryl, it was poison. In later years, when asked about male co-stars she found difficult, she never mentioned his name, not out of mercy, but out of indifference. To her, he had become a symbol of the kind of masculinity Hollywood once worshipped, charming, brilliant, and blind to its own destructiveness. "Some men need chaos to feel alive," she said once in an interview. "I learned to build peace, even when it made them uncomfortable." Not every wound is loud. Some are disguised as laughter between takes. For Meryl Streep, Jack Nicholson was not a villain, he was a mirror that cracked, showing her what happens when genius forgets its limits. Madonna, the war of egos. They were never meant to be enemies. In the late 80s, both Meryl Streep and Madonna stood at the height of their power, one representing discipline, the other rebellion. One conquered cinema through restraint. The other dominated music through defiance. They should have admired each other. Instead, they became symbols of two clashing versions of womanhood in Hollywood, the respected artist and the unapologetic provocateur. The spark began with Evita. Madonna wanted the role for years. She saw it as her artistic redemption. Meryl had already played the complex woman, the tragic mother, the intellectual heroine. When reports surfaced that she, too, was being considered for Evita, the tabloids ignited a war. Madonna reportedly said in an interview, "I hope they don't give it to Meryl. She's great. But she's had enough turns pretending to be powerful women." It was a sharp, calculated strike, and it stung. Meryl stayed silent publicly, but her friends recall her saying, "Power doesn't need to announce itself." When Evita finally went to Madonna, the competition became personal. During promotion, Madonna hinted that Hollywood actresses hide behind characters, while singers live their truth. Meryl understood what that meant. She didn't respond. She never did, but the feud had already become a headline. Madonna versus Streep, Queen versus S. Saint. Behind closed doors, the tension grew stranger. At a fashion event in New York, the two women crossed paths for the first time. Witnesses say Madonna offered a cool smile and said, "You should have played my mother." Meryl smiled back and replied, "Only if I could rewrite the ending." The moment went viral in gossip columns, brief, cutting, and unforgettable. For Meryl, the conflict wasn't about envy, it was about principle. She saw in Madonna the commercialization of rebellion, a woman using shock as a weapon. For Madonna, Meryl represented everything she wanted to destroy: the old guard's approval, the need for permission, the quiet dignity that refused to scream. Years later, when asked about Madonna in a magazine profile, Meryl gave a surgical answer. "She's a remarkable businesswoman." And that's a compliment, though not in the way she might want it. It was the kind of line only Meryl could deliver: precise, elegant, fatal. Madonna fired back in a radio interview, saying, "Some people act their entire lives. I just live mine." But by then, the battle had lost its heat. The press moved on, but the distance remained. They never reconciled, not out of hatred, but out of pride. In her later years, Meryl admitted that she respected Madonna's courage, even if she found it exhausting. She fought to be heard. "I fought to be understood." Maybe that's why we never met in the middle. Their war wasn't fought on sets or stages, it was fought through ideals. One believed in silence, the other in noise. And both were right in their own way. Sometimes rivalry isn't about who wins, but about what each refuses to become. Meryl Streep didn't hate Madonna for her defiance. She hated how much it reminded her of her own buried fire. Spike Lee, the public war. The feud with Spike Lee didn't begin in a studio, it began in headlines. It was the mid-1990s, and Hollywood was entering a new era of identity and representation. Spike Lee, the fiery director who gave voice to Black America, had built his reputation on confrontation. Meryl Streep, the quiet titan of Hollywood, had built hers on empathy. Their worlds collided over one of the most sensitive subjects in the industry: who gets to tell whose story? It started after a film festival panel where Meryl, speaking about diversity in Hollywood, said, "Art should belong to everyone. Empathy is not limited by race or gender." The statement, meant to sound inclusive, was received as tone-deaf. Days later, Spike Lee responded publicly, "Empathy is nice, But history doesn't need sympathy, it needs accountability. The quote exploded across entertainment news. Suddenly, Meryl became a target for criticism she didn't expect. She stayed silent at first, believing the controversy would fade. But it didn't. Spike continued to speak, accusing Hollywood's elite of playing liberal while staying comfortable. When a journalist asked Meryl to comment, she replied carefully, "I believe in listening before defending. But I also believe in the right to imagine. That's what art is." Her words were calm, but beneath the surface lay exhaustion. She had spent her career walking a fragile line between empathy and appropriation, between representing others and being accused of misunderstanding them. Spike Lee's accusation hit where it hurt, not her ego, but her integrity. A year later, the two found themselves seated at the same award ceremony. Cameras caught the tension. When Spike passed by her table, Meryl stood to greet him. He nodded curtly, shook her hand, and moved on. The exchange lasted less than 5 seconds, but it fueled weeks of media analysis. To the world, it looked like bitterness. To Meryl, it was sadness, the recognition that good intentions could still wound. In a rare interview years later, she addressed the feud indirectly. "I think people mistake silence for ignorance. Sometimes it's restraint, the choice not to add more noise to an already painful conversation." Spike, for his part, remained unapologetic. "She's brilliant," he said once. But Hollywood doesn't need empathy from above. It needs humility from within. Meryl understood the truth in his words. That's what made them sting even more. Their disagreement was never about race or politics. It was about perception. Spike wanted revolution. Meryl wanted understanding. Both believed in change. But they spoke different languages. When the Academy later honored Meryl with a Lifetime Achievement Award, Spike didn't attend. Yet, in an interview that same week, he surprised everyone by saying, "She's the real deal. Just not my kind of real." Meryl never responded. She didn't need to. Theirs was not a feud to be resolved. It was a dialogue that could never find a common rhythm. Some wars are fought in public, but the wounds stay private. For Meryl Streep, Spike Lee was not an enemy. He was the reminder that even empathy has limits, and that good intentions are never enough in a world built on misunderstanding. Michael Moore, the final trigger. By the time her name collided with Michael Moore's, Meryl Streep had already learned to survive the politics of Hollywood. She had endured egos, insults, and moral wars. But Moore was different. He wasn't a co-star or a rival. He was a provocateur, a filmmaker who used truth as a weapon, and he had aimed it directly at her. The conflict began in the early 2000s, when Moore publicly criticized what he called the hypocrisy of liberal Hollywood. During a political roundtable, he mentioned Meryl by name, saying, "She talks about the people, but she dines with the powerful." The quote struck like a slap. It wasn't about her talent. It was about her integrity, the one thing she had guarded more fiercely than fame. Meryl didn't respond immediately. She rarely did. But the damage was done. Overnight. Her image as Hollywood's moral compass became a target for cynicism. Talk shows replayed Moore's statement. Commentators debated whether she had become too establishment, to a woman who had spent her life walking the fine line between activism and artistry. The accusation felt like betrayal. When she finally addressed it in a later interview, her tone was measured but sharp. It's easy to criticize from outside the room. Harder to change what happens inside it. Moore replied in an op-ed, Doubling down, if you're inside the room, maybe you've already become the problem. It was no longer a political disagreement, it was personal. Meryl had admired Moore's documentaries. She once called him one of the few who still believe in conscience. Now, she felt that faith turned against her. In private, she told a friend, "He wants purity. I want progress." Maybe we're both naive. The clash reached its peak during an awards ceremony where both were present. Moore's Fahrenheit 9/11 was nominated. Meryl, seated just rows behind him, watched as he gave his acceptance speech, fiery, accusatory, unapologetic. Cameras caught her expression, calm, expressionless, unreadable. Later that night, a journalist asked what she thought. She answered quietly, "I think anger needs a direction. Otherwise, it just burns the wrong people." Years later, when the topic resurfaced, Meryl's words carried less defense and more reflection. "I understand him now. He hates what power does to people. I do too. But maybe the difference is I've seen what it costs to fight it from within." Moore never apologized. He didn't need to. In his eyes, she represented the contradiction he built his career exposing. And in hers, he embodied the rage she had long tried to control, the kind that destroys as easily as it awakens. Their story never ended with reconciliation, only with quiet fatigue. Time turned both of them into symbols, him of rebellion, her of restraint. They stood for the same values but carried them in opposite ways. When asked years later if she still resented him, she smiled and said, "No, but I remember." Every legend faces a moment when ideals turn against them. For Meryl Streep, Michael Moore was that moment, the final trigger that proved even truth, when weaponized, can wound the people who believe in it most. 6 names, 6 battles, 6 reflections of the world that shaped her and the woman she refused to become. John Wayne, Dustin Hoffman, Jack Nicholson, Madonna, Spike Lee, Michael Moore. Each carried a lesson disguised as conflict. They weren't just rivals, they were mirrors, forcing Meryl Streep to confront her own principles, her limits, and the contradictions of fame. She had built a career on empathy, yet her greatest trials came from those who mistook it for weakness. She fought without raising her voice, survived without surrendering her grace. And through it all, she learned that even kindness can become armor when the world demands blood. Now, in her twilight years, her silence speaks louder than any confession. She doesn't seek forgiveness, nor revenge. What remains is clarity, the understanding that hatred, too, is a form of truth, one that reveals where love once lived. "I don't carry grudges," she once said softly. "I just remember who taught me to stand still." 6 names, 6 wounds, and one woman who turned them into art. In Hollywood, everyone has a hate list. The difference is that Meryl Streep turned hers into wisdom.